And we're live. Hey guys, welcome back to Whiskey Charlie, our monthly wargame chat on YouTube. I'm Mo from Mo's Game Table, and joining me tonight are my co-hosts, everyone's favorite Gimp with the Limp, Nate Rogers, the Gimpy Gamer. Nate, how's it going?
Going great. Nice to see you all again.
And the wargaming wizard from Oz, Kev Sharp from the Big Board. Hey Kev, how's it going?
Good, mate. How are you?
Not too bad. And tonight we have a very special guest, Natalia from Wargaming Experiences. Her new book, we're going to discuss that. I didn't mean to say from, because she's not from Wargaming Experiences, but she just wrote a book called Wargaming Experiences, and we're going to talk to her about her new book, as well as her experiences designing games and running games for NATO. Welcome to the show, Natalia.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And I guess I have to wait for a cool nickname, so I will keep it for the end of the show.
We will come up with something for you by the end of the show.
Yeah.
But the new book, Wargaming Experiences, which you so graciously sent me a copy of, is a fantastic read, and really enjoyed it. And what was the impetus for you to write this book?
Well, thank you for the compliment. I think there was a couple of reasons that you also see in the preface of the book, but more or less I wrapped up a project of 5 years, and I wanted to keep a summary of it, as well as a lot of lessons that came out of that time, and to just summarize what I have experienced, because on one side I saw that when you are entering wargaming, it is quite a steep curve, and there is not many consensus on very basic things. So I wanted to at least describe these dilemmas that I see when you are entering, and more or less as well how I grew into designing and what other people can learn from it and take it forward, because I see that more as a conversation than as a monologue, and that's why I thought, all right, it's a good time to write it down, as well as I also looked at the solutions that I was proposing, and I thought the longer I wait with it, the more I forget about it. So I thought, okay, when I was looking through my notes, yeah, I fixed it already, but I have not remembered it after a while. So I thought that would be neat to keep it in one place as a good summary. And in the end, I would have to ask you if you have already read it, but I think that was achieved.
Yeah, no, I've read most of it. I've not finished it yet, but I've read most of it, and I did read in the preface you were talking about, you know, what caused you to write the book, and you really write everything out in the book in you know, pretty clean order too. Like, I'll just, because I don't want to mess it up here. At the beginning, you start with say introduction, why war game, then you go into the definition of what is a war game, and then you move all the way through that into war games that you facilitated over the years and your experiences with them. And, you know, it's different from what we do as commercial, you know, hobby wargamers versus what you do on the professional side of things. How many commercial or hobby games, I just say commercial because we look at you as professional on that side of things, and what we do is commercial hobby. What are the differences that you've seen by playing hobby war games and professional war games?
Well, I would say that the purpose is the main thing that differentiates the two, in the way that, of course, in the hobby part, fun is the priority. So once I asked on Twitter what makes a good war game and how do you facilitate it well, and somebody told me, I don't understand the question, you facilitate it well if people have fun. Whereas on the professional side, fun is secondary, and you have to look on the expectation of what is to be achieved. And I also would say that in the hobby wargaming, all the people that meet around the table are there because they already like to do that. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you do it professionally, which I would say is in a work time, then you might encounter different types of players, and they would not always be friendly towards this method. And that was for me also the reason to write out all the conversation I had. Why do you use wargaming? What is wargaming? How does it look like? Because we cannot assume that everybody already has initial experience with wargaming. So that was the reason that I went from, you could say, basic stuff, but as I mentioned, I don't think it is established yet. It is just starting up, towards practical applications and more structural and formulas that I was using to approach different cases, and as well what I learned from it and what can be observed when you compare them. So in short, I would say that the purpose and the players are different, but there is also a lot of commonalities. So that is something that I would say you could play the professional war game and still enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
And as well for the professionals that are using a lot of scenarios that are already out there, they also look into what is on the commercial side. I know I am definitely looking there to see what is being developed. So on that note, I would say that it is a big discipline and all the other parts have their contribution. So I'm very happy to mix them.
Well, I have one comment, and then I'm going to pass it off to my two co-hosts for a question. But you know, it's funny. You said player, and I think reading your book and then also looking at the professional side of things when it comes to war games, I wouldn't say player as much as I'd say participant, because you're pulling in people that, like you said, that maybe feel uneasy in the situation. They're civilians. They don't normally deal with or even consider thinking about war games or war. And you're pulling them into a situation where, you have to think outside the box. You have to think outside your comfort zone. And what would you do in this situation? And how would you work with local authorities and law enforcement, government officials, as well as the military, to make sure you have all of the, essential services, as well as law and order, and of course, Homeland Defense as well. So there a lot of things are posited there that are pretty interesting.
Was there a slide to a question, or you would?
Yeah, no, I was making the comment. Now you guys go.
I gotta say, I am curious how you actually got involved with this, because I don't anticipate that a lot of people would just pick up and say, I think I'm gonna do wargaming for NATO. So I'm assuming there's like a background there somewhere that got you started down that path. Do you mind telling me what it was?
Yeah, sure. I will just start with that. Well, I have joined the NATO Center for Civil Military Cooperation, and I started in the training and education branch. But very quickly I noticed, well, you could say very standard, but also very boring practices. So a lot of the courses were lectures driven and they were also outdated. And I was working on something called global programming, which was aligning the training needs with the solutions. And at that time, I noticed, yeah, there is a lot of practice missing, and there is virtually no connection between mission experience and what is being proposed in the classroom as standardized training. And at that time, I was going deeper into the topic and wrote a proposal to do more practical exercises, and I framed it into wargaming already. And we presented that project with my boss at that time to start a 4-year development into NATO's system. And that was approved after a year of efforts. And that pretty much started what I was doing for the next 4 years. And if you ask me where did it come from, well, that journey was a bit longer. So already a couple of years back, I was quite interested in maneuver warfare theory as well as exercises. So I started with that academic angle to look into the discipline. And when I got the chance, then I proposed to do something about it in practical terms. And fortunately, that was possible. And I see that it is developing very slowly within NATO, because it also is a huge organization with high bureaucracy. So any innovation is crawling, it will not be running. But that got me quite far into implementation. So after the first wargame was successful, it created, I would say, waves within the organization. So people noticed it, and we got more and more requests to do something like that. And with that, I was very happy to continue.
Were you involved in just the theoretical side, so like the tabletop and laying out the units and stuff like that, or did you actually get to go out into the field and experience some of the practical? Because when I was in the military, our wargaming was suiting up with either laser tag basically on our rifles or using paintball, and we would wargame certain scenarios like breaching a house or stuff like that. So did you get to get physical, or was yours more just the theoretical side?
I would say both.
Oh, that's awesome.
Well, I have to admit that we did not have many tabletops, as I think you would translate it into a kind of game in the box where you open it and play it out. We had a lot of exercises that were group exercises, so we would have teams playing against each other and doing something about a given scenario. And that was mostly based within the location. If we went outside, that was attached to a physical exercise that had more components to it. So then you could do additional tasks within wargaming that gives you a good experimental use. And then again, you would have to come back to what was the purpose of a given war game, because if we played on strategic or operational level, then of course the tactical skirmishes were not the main focus. But if they were, then we would come back and try to check it with reality. But that also depended whether we got the resources for it or not. And that was, let's say, the connection. So every time I would make a war game, I would anyway trace back people that are involved in a given topic or area, capability, whatever is the focus, and I would interview them on whether this represents the truth or whether it was just a model representation that is not complete. So I think that is really important to come back to the basics there, and there is no way around it. So you should always tour what you are playing on the professional level. If it's not only for fun, then I think it's a big responsibility not to overstate something that is not correct. And I saw it with a lot of games that were, let's say, trickling down from the academic level. And I spoke about it with other presentations as well. There is an example of African war game that basically said to the participants that the biggest problem you will encounter is malaria, and gave them tips how to protect themselves. But if somebody was deployed to Mali, he will have a very different problem, because that is the deadliest UN mission on the ground at the moment. So if you now misrepresent it and tell it to your participant or player or a person that takes this as a training, and they assign a level of truth to it, then I think this is very dangerous. And that's why it cannot be a standalone if you are speaking about professional wargaming, in my view, because as I said, there's a lot of examples where this went wrong.
I don't want to monopolize you. I know Kevin's like jumping to.
Kevin's like, shut up already. I want to go.
I'll ask a question in a sec. Go ahead, Kev.
Cool. So I had a two-part question. I was going to do two questions, but I'll do one question with two parts so that I can get in before they jump back. But but you mentioned that you had an interest in maneuver theory, right? In maneuver theory, right? So you discussed that at one point. Are the games that you design, are they focused on geopolitical level types of situations? And how would you parlay any of that into your interest in maneuver war theory at all? Or are the games more focused on more tactical theater-wide situations? So I'm just curious about the scope of the scenarios you're designing, and are you designing for effect, or is it just, like you said, a preset of conditions? Sorry, that was a long question.
No, I think that was broad, but very much applicable. Well, I didn't say much yet, maybe what got into the book, but I will say more about the whole project. So I think there's 9 war games that I described in the book because I thought they were important, but I would say after 4 years, I ended up with around 30 prototypes, and that meant that the spectrum was quite broad as well. So at the highest level, we had political strategic exercises. There was quite a fair number of operational, and I would say around 10% was tactical. So those were indeed the classic duels with the hexagons and with the counters, and with representation of basically a platoon level of different sides. Whereas if we went up to the higher levels, on operational level, we would look at the region and what would be possible plans to either attack it or defend it. So you would play around with your headquarters and bigger groups, battle groups. Whereas on the strategic political level, I did some work on so-called strategic direction south, and that was for NATO at the time, Middle East, North Africa. And as you know, I would also say that there is a lot of issues there, and the learning process is quite broken. So for us, the question was, what would be the relation between development, population, and security? So a lot of times you noticed, for example, we built the wells and then we bombed them. So, okay, how can you represent these issues in the game and make people think about sequencing and priorities? And we also added you could call it population factor. So if you would lose the support of the population, your actions would be less effective. So in that way, we represented, all right, if you are perceived as the enemy, you will not win in the long term. And you could, let's say, improve and develop within the big region. And I have to say that although the game was quite well received, the audience for it was so small that in the end it is on a dusty shelf somewhere now in headquarters and awaits its glory. But
okay, that's very insightful.
That's bureaucracy for you right there, right?
Something amazing hidden on a shelf. Sorry, go ahead.
Did you have another part to that question, Kev? No. Oh, you just combine it into one big broad question. Oh, no, because I wanted to get to some audience questions here. We do have some here. Matt Chestnut is asking, is there an audio version of the book, of your book, Wargaming Experiences? I do most of his reading while mowing the lawn. So he's wanting to see if you can come out and help him out mow the lawn by having the audiobook version of your book.
Well, the answer is not yet. For now, it is a paperback. In September, I am expecting the ebook. So I would say audiobook would be following after that. But I am not sure if there is enough interest. So I note much request, and I will forward it to the publisher, but we have to see whether that is picked up or not.
Well, we'll hope that it does get picked up, because I think that would be really interesting, and anybody mowing the lawn or driving into work will be able to listen to it. Harold says he's very interested in Natalia and wargaming experiences, so he's in the audience tonight. Wargame HQ, he says he just bought your book.
And it is waiting actually on the table. I will ship it tomorrow because it is the signed version. So,
nice. Very nice.
I think it should arrive 7 to 10 days, technically.
So there's your book right there. It's right behind her shoulder.
Yeah, it is right there.
And I had a couple more. I know there was one here. I got to scroll down to find what Harold had asked one. He was talking to me about fighting trains, and I said, no, we're not going to fight trains here. If you just drop CAS on them, and then you don't worry about it. But I do have one question. You were talking before about, before I get down to these other questions, you were talking about civilians, bringing civilians into these situations that you do with professionals. We all kind of, as wargamers, some of us are veterans, some of us are not, but we all have a shared interest in military history. We have a broad understanding of it, if not a specialized understanding in some instances. For civilians, they're introduced in something out of their realm, like I was saying before. Have you found anything that surprised you when bringing in civilians into this into these war games, where they think outside the box, they think completely different than a military person would, and they surprise you with a pretty interesting solution to a problem that you've put in front of them?
Great question.
Well, let me start from the beginning. When I started the project, I also thought that we should try to move a lot of elements within the standard war games, and one of them that I tried to push was adding new players to war games, and that was indeed civilians or the local population. And on the other side, NGOs, humanitarians, so organizations that are in the conflict area but rarely do get any avatars or icons on the board. So that was something I did with most of the war games to show that it is part of the area, and it influences, of course, how forces win or lose. So that was already easier, let's say, if we had this representation, because it brings a different perspective to what we are gaming. And it is realistic, so I think we owe it to the personnel to also show what kind of problems stem from that differences. And then if you ask me, all right, what about civilians that play war games? That's scenarios where they are already present. But most of the time, I have to say, we tried to bring people out of their comfort zone, which meant we tried to make military play the civilian side and the other way around. So they would understand what are the rules of engagement or code of conduct in terms of civilians, and they would kind of meet each other halfway. And there is a lot of observations on that topic, I would say, not only mine. And indeed, that brings the level of understanding higher, but also shows, for example, civilians seeking neutrality. So if they would have a choice in the war game, they would go for something that does not decisively end the situation. They would try to negotiate between it, or sometimes slow down the escalation. But there was also an opposite effect, and that was in a war game on nuclear forces, where they, let's say, hypothetically escalated to see what was the worst case scenario. So you would be very aggressive.
Let's just see how this turns out.
That was pushing back guys to not annihilate the capital city. So I really see that this is necessary to find the language between, or a space between, where you can discuss what are the realities of both, because each group brings a different perspective. And I can also give an example that comes back in the book. That was a scenario from the Battle of Mosul. And at the time that different sides were battling out for the center of the city, there was 250,000 civilians jammed into cellars, basically, because they received the warning that the coalition forces are coming into the city, and they were advised on the leaflets to stay at home, to close the doors and stay at home. But after that came the air raid. So that was quite a deadly trap that was created. And with that situation, I have introduced the local population as an active player. So that means they could actually influence the red team and the blue team, in at least in their thinking, because I don't think, or I don't believe that changed their decisions, but they could see what was the influence on the ground when they were making them. So I think that that is really a clue of many of the war games, and you also see that coming back in the coin series, that if you lose on this front, the whole war is prolonged, and it is very often not anymore able to be decided. And that is what also came back in Mosul. So we had 3 rounds that spoke about the kinetic side and the victory in terms of dominating the terrain. But after that, we had a 4th round about reconstruction of the city and the population that was very much exposed or escaped from that area, and also identification of the enemy within the population that stayed. So that 4th round was something that a lot of participants have seen for the first time, which maybe is also a statement about our exit strategies and long-term thinking. So I was very curious to see how that played out, and there was a lot of consensus that we need to do more there.
I gotta say, I'm thrilled to hear you talking about the opposing forces hiding in with the civilian population, because we experienced that a lot. I served a couple of tours in Iraq, and that happened to us all the time. A lot of them would dress up in the traditional civilian garb, or they drive taxis, or sometimes they would dress up as women, and we couldn't tell who the bad guy was, and it was very obvious why they did it, because it puts us in a lose-lose situation. We either potentially hurt a civilian that we don't want to, or we don't know that this is an actual bad guy, and they catch us with our head in the ground, you know? So that it's great that you guys are actually wargaming that. But something you mentioned earlier kind of stuck with me, and you were talking about the academic level and their thought processes on wargaming and it coming down, and you noticing that what they were proposing seemed not to line up with reality. And I would agree with you on that, because it always, Mo, what was that saying? The no plan survives
no plan survives first contact with the enemy.
Yeah, never. And it's a very true statement. So 100% with you on that, the academics just don't see it. And did you find that to be like a really common thread? So is there like a group of think tankers who are sitting around who just have no experience, and then they're like, oh, this is what we think is a good idea, and you kind of look at it like, no, this is a bad idea. We're going to change all this?
Yeah, I think that this saying could be also applied here, and you could say that no war game survives first contact with practitioner, because that is what has to be bridged. And indeed, I've seen a lot of examples where designers are projecting their own thoughts into the rules, and then they think it's a result. So I would say you have, that was a very bad war game I saw, but the rule was you have only 1 minute to discuss distribution of your resources. And we played around 4 rounds, and between the rounds, I think we could, in the end, crack it. So we would say, you go to north, I go to east, and you take the medication, and I will take the equipment. So I would say it was not an unbreakable system. And then I hear the conclusion of the war game that there is a problem with communication.
And
That is, of course, false. That is your projection from the rules that you made yourself, and then you concluded that we had the problem, which was completely not true. And also, I would really contest, where did you take it from? So why is that the rule in the game? Because you could introduce it if it was based on any real life situation, and I did that many times. But if you have just made it because you thought it's interesting or it's a good challenge, then you have to present it this way, that despite communication block in the rules, participants are able to fix it by round 3. And then it is not realistic, but it is at least compliant with what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a lot of misconceptions that are lost in translation. And there is also, let's say, a big problem where people translate previous wars into current or future problems.
Mm-hmm.
So you would see that coming back a lot. And the remedy for me was, as I mentioned, to either experience it myself, or I would interview people that have done that. And I also tested the war games with very varied audiences. So anybody should be basically able to understand what the game is about and comment whether it is true or not. So you would not get stuck into your own head and just project what you think is right. And then the worst example of that I had was actually a big project that was a computer simulation where people chose ABC as an answer. And the problem was already coded in it. So they wanted you to choose the answer they thought is right. Whereas I even didn't agree with the problem. And I tried to speak to the designers because I flagged this solution as a danger to our personnel because of that misconceptions. But the designers just kept on saying the same things, only louder. So I was not able to get in a conversation with them. And then I said, okay, if I take now a soldier and show him this system, either you are really creating a harmful picture for them, or they would tell you you are wrong. But both of these results, of course, are not what you want to achieve with the professional war game.
So it's kind of a presumptive strategy, isn't it? So you have a concept that's built around an abstract idea about what some relative truth is, that is then applied into a system, and then you're expected to go game it and then prove that their theory works, even though it may be completely divorced from reality. So can we say that you're at the forefront of trying to put realistic wargaming, professional wargaming together versus more presumptive things? Is that a fair statement?
I would say that in the end, that story had maybe a good and a bad ending, because I went to the commander and I told him what is the actual danger if he releases this game as a pre-deployment training, and he listened and he shared this opinion once he saw that solution. So that was, let's say, fine to indeed take it out of the equation. But on the other side, if you imagine what kind of resources and time was taken to construct it, then it can lead to a lot of anger, because that was, let's say, a time, and I see that coming as well in phases where scientists or industry gets interested for 5 minutes. So there are people that will come in, want to make a 3-month project, and then maybe commercially make some money and then get out. And this was the case that indeed there was a couple of scientists that said they will make a war game, and I think they planned it for a couple of months and then ended it. So they were not interested in any reality check, and that is maybe why they talked over me, and they were not interested in learning any lessons about it. So if they would make an iteration testing, I think it would quickly come back that this is not realistic. This was your indeed assumptions, and they were very wrong, because I'm not saying you particularly need combat experience from that place, but it helps if you know what you are modeling. So at least you should have people on your team that know what is happening there. And then that was not the case. So that was purely academic theory, and a very bad one. So it exists on paper, but it does not compare to reality in any way. And that is why I think it always has to be calibrated. And you can do it different ways, but the most important part as a designer is you are open to it and you are chasing it. Because, of course, we do not want to change the design or sometimes destroy it. But I have actually chosen an opposite way. So I've made a number of prototypes and I played them against each other. So you will see which part of the solution is good or which part is bad and why. So I did a number of comparative experiments where I tested whether the historical occurrence scenario is better, whether digital or tabletop is better, whether the facilitator plays the main part or the war game. So I facilitated the game, or I took my colleagues, they did it, and then we compared what were the evaluations, so we would know whether it is an individual presentation that is very good or it is the solution itself. So I called it the unnatural selection, where we had a lot of options which we could kill off and then go into the best solutions that are confirmed over time. And I can say that in this situation, I had access also to commanders of the given area or headquarters, so I could basically ask them, is that the correct requirement we are training or not? And what are the biggest problems they notice with the personnel that is assigned? And from there we could go into truth, and we could also say that once the commander is content with how realistic the wargame is, then it would be difficult to dispute it, not on the premise of their rank, but on the premise of what they perceive as a priority.
Now we get another question from the audience here. Harold Buchanan, a wargame designer himself, he says here, how long are the players involved in a NATO wargame? How many players? And what is the variety of disciplines of the players that are involved?
All right. Harold, thank you for joining and thank you for the question. How long are the players involved? It depends what is the wargame. So the longest time I was given was 2 days to play out a wargame. On average, it would be 3 hours. And then that is normally the ending of the training. So that would be like an end test where they can apply the knowledge they supposedly gained. How many players? The smallest group I had was 6 people, and that was maybe on the political level, that's why it was such a small group. The biggest one, 100. So I would then classify it as a mega game. The variety of disciplines is basically endless. So we had special forces operators, and we had legats, legal advisors. So it depends on the purpose of the war game and what is being trained. If we involved the social layer, then we had much broader training group than if we would only train contingency plans or this kind of. So I would say we always try to get diversity because that opens up different perspectives. But then again, it can also be misleading. So it depends on the scenario very much.
And we got another one here. Wargame HQ says, Does Natalia have multinational counterparts that share her role or work on her team within NATO so that they can wargame the cooperation or the cooperation between command control and logistics?
Well, maybe I will clarify the first part. I have moved to a university in The Hague as of March. So all of the book and all of the experiences I'm sharing is basically from the last 5 years. So I would have maybe a lot of people that share my role as university lecturer, but as a wargame designer in NATO, I'm afraid that's a no. And the problem there is the digital parts, the simulations are very much outsourced. So you would have designers outside of NATO and you would have operators inside. And for the tabletops, I would say that headquarters very often either organize it themselves or they ask somebody that would be in my position, but it is not a fixed structure yet. Maybe it will be developing. I know that there are some works in Norway to establish such capability, and then they would be able to speak about it more, but they are not yet operational. As for my team, I can say it openly that I was a team of one. So I was a department
One-woman show.
that fit in one office, and very often my colleagues assisted me, but that was more on premise of willingness than of official assignment. So that was how it was run, and unfortunately it was not institutionalized, so the project ended and wargaming dissipated.
So wargaming hobbyists don't have to worry about anything here because even the professional wargamers don't get the respect we deserve. So it's systemic everywhere. It's just part of the whole gig. And then Nick had a question here. We'll one last question for right now from the audience. He says, what are some of the objectives of the war games that you've developed? Planning, logistics, coordination of combined arms, or coalition ops, so on and so forth.
I would say that logistics are very much belonging with operations research. So they were simulated in the digital solutions because that is pretty much counting and distribution lanes. So that was not necessarily included in my objectives. And I struggled to come up with one answer because every wargame had a different objective. But yes, planning was included, coordination as well. There was a lot of objectives that pertained to host nation and NATO. So how to basically mobilize forces, take them to the right place, and how the international agreements would work with use of force on a NATO territory. Because the expeditionary forces, I think we have covered, at least in theory. In practice, that is something else. So the coalition operations indeed took most of our efforts, and I would also say I particularly looked at the point of escalation. So we have now a lot of actions that are below the threshold of war, and how you could gain that point where it is turning from hybrid or deterrence activities into open conflict, or if it is not turning into open conflict because it is not attributed to a particular player or faction, then what kind of counteractions do you have in your sleeve? So the objectives were, depending on the level, very much focused on defending NATO's territory, but also the population. So if it was targeted, as in the case of one of the war games that traced the Skripal case study, that was the British citizen at that time that was murdered in UK in Salisbury by Russian toxin. And now everything about it is, of course, the first precedent of such a case. And I have constructed a scenario where that would be the focus. So the population is attacked, not the territory. It's not the tanks at the border. It's something that crawls under our lines, and we have to fight it back. And where, if we consider that NATO has military advantage, you have an intelligent enemy that is looking into your weakness. So he is trying to push against places where military would not be the right solution or would be not effective. And that was what was a lot of times war gamed.
Nate?
I was curious about the security precautions you guys would take, because I would kind of figure that you wouldn't want everyone to just know what you're wargaming. So, you know, for us, we've got security clearances that you have to have depending on your occupation. So did you guys have a background check system you would do on the people that you wargamed with? And if so, like, what was your classification level and how did all that work?
It reminds me your question of such sketch that was shown in US, where the general is announcing that our forces are landing, but they cannot comment where precisely. And the journalist is asking, yes, but where? And he says, well, I cannot comment on it because that would put, of course, the person in danger. But the journalist, he says, okay, but I'm curious, where did they go? And, you know, it's a back and forth conversation. So depending on the information that is in the war game, indeed, then a different security level applies. And it can be anything. So if you have open source information, it can be played out in an open environment, but the deeper you go into sensitive information, the more secure will be the area, and the deeper the background checks on the participants indeed. But the details of it can be conveyed by other more professional people than me.
Oh, so you weren't involved with the background checks. They just brought you people like, these people are clear. You can wargame with them. They're clean.
Then forget it. They'd bring in the wargamers and say, they're just a bunch of clowns. You can play with these guys.
No, it of course depended on the war game and the setting. So it was very much, again, purpose bound. What would be war gamed dictated who would war game, and the information in the war game would dictate how far the security has to be involved.
So where did you take everything once you were done? So let's say you war gamed this. We're invading Africa and we're going to take it over. So we've taken over Africa and you've got your little battle plan. What did you do with your battle plan when you were done with it? Did that just get sent up to the NATO brass or filed away in case of, you know, how did all of your reports end up working out?
Again, depending on the purpose, the reports were, of course, as always, pushed up the chain of command. So the commander would see what his personnel was doing, basically, for the given amount of time, and depending on the usability of the conclusion. So if you had it on strategic level, then we would say which kind of strategies were proposed and what are the limitations or effectiveness that we have noticed within the given parameters of the war game. On operational level, you could see how does interoperability work, or on tactical level, you would simply look what were the details of different situations. And then you also have to get down on earth and realize that this report probably is not read. So maybe 5% of the executive summary is actually looked at. And if in that space you can smuggle something interesting and applicable, then your reports have a chance of having an impact within the organization. But I think it is extremely limited if I am a realist for a minute.
Oh, that's just sad. I'm sure you've had a great impact. So you never like watch the news and see them like doing some combat formation, like, oh, I did that. I wargamed that. That's my design.
I would like to believe that dream, yes.
Kev?
So I'm curious about the discussions and the modeling you did around low-level conflict, sort of under the war threshold. How do the various parties react to that sort of gaming? Because it's so amorphous. So what's the reaction like to them, and do people escalate quickly, or do they try and solve the problem? What are the end states that sort of come out of that?
Well, I would say that maybe the strongest representation of that was in the Baltic scenario, because you can see that it is very much on the border between the factions, and you can see that there is no kinetic action yet, but there is influencing operations. So it is a very good point to model the dynamics there. And if you would take into account peacetime and at least opened dialogue between the two sides, you can notice what they would do within tactical level confrontation. So that is what I have done with the Baltic challenge, and we had groups that were proposing actions based on their mission. And if you ask me about the red team, indeed, if it is an intelligent enemy, they will propose a lot of positive actions because it is very difficult to counter them. So if you would do funding of different cultural events or demonstrations or art or education, then what would be the response that you can employ? You, of course, don't know at the time that it can have a hidden agenda, but it does. And we had evidence of that, for example, with NGOs that were receiving funding from Ministry of Defense or Ministry of Foreign Affairs of our neighbors. So obviously they did have other ideas than only serving the peace and prosperity, the classic ideas. And in that case, how you would identify it and counter it. We also played it out with Blue Team that you can also notice this is very realistic because they mostly preoccupy themselves with sports events or parades or picnics, things like that. And you have to ask yourself, what is the effectiveness of that other than creating contact with the local population? Because at least in the Baltic states, the support for NATO is already very high. So, okay, what are you trying to achieve with that actions? Because they do not counter the ones that I mentioned before. And then we had also the white team that was representatives of different organizations, but the neutral ones, so they would not be aligned with either of the sides. And in the book, I describe a curious case where the UN won the Baltics. And the reason was that neutral organizations had much higher credibility. So as I told you before, civilians tend to go for extremes. And if they are seeking neutrality against possible escalation because their peace and status quo is satisfying, then they would align themselves more with the neutral than with the blue team. And this is a space that can be very well leveraged, unfortunately, if you don't know about that dynamic. And in that case, you have to look at catalog of actions that can be mapped. And the Baltic Challenge was played over a very long time, well, given the circumstances of wargaming, because it was running for 2-3 years until my departure. I think it is still going on. So you could say that there is an outcome where they would map effectiveness of different classes of actions within that scenario of peacetime with under the threshold of war actions of different groups, because we also looked at state and non-state actors that are taking part in such manipulations.
To clarify something that you were saying there, you're talking about the white team and that they want peace, right? So when you're saying that, do you mean that like they'll accept an occupation by maybe the red team if it's peaceful? Is that what you're kind of implying, that the white team would go for? Something maybe blue team wouldn't be happy about, but the white team's okay with it as long as there's no violence? Or did I understand that wrong?
Well, let's say the circumstances that we have put the teams in was still peacetime. So that meant during peacetime, the neutral organizations did not choose a side yet. Because I agree with you, there is a lot of scenarios where white team is operating on the occupied territory, and they don't like to say it, but they also work with military forces present there. So that was not, let's say, the point to which we have went, because we did not escalate towards open hostilities yet. We were just mapping deterrence, peacetime, and how the red team could gain influence that would open the doors for later leverage.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they're
Starting
trying to kind of influence things so they'll have a friendly white team. So instead of white team being friendly to the blue team, they'll be friendly to the red team when red team comes in. Okay, I get what you're saying now.
Setting the table for the future.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Now, spinning off something that Kev had just asked you about, everybody's responses and stuff. Now, you have all these different teams and staffs that are in war games, and I would assume there's going to be a mix of sexes in those, male and female, playing together in various roles in these games. And how well have you seen men and women work together? And do you see any tendencies more from men than women and vice versa when they're in these environments?
I would say that I never focused on it. So that would be the best case scenario where we are speaking about wargamers as a group, and I do not see if the gender has influence on how they play the games or how they are perceived in the games. So I saw different formats, and I would also not say that there is a general rule about it. Of course, you can notice, and it's a fact, that women do not, they are a small portion of wargamers, so they do not exceed 5% or 10% in some countries of the whole population, and that can create an effect on its own. But I think, at least from my observations, it is growing over time, so I would not also drill into that, because I'm not sure, let's say, what was the original reason for such small participation, and I do not know that, so I would have to think about it, but I see positive trends that it is growing, and maybe the more women is shown, the more is attracted to it. So
that's good.
To start somewhere. In science, they call it the Scully effect. So when the X-Files was released, there was not a lot of women scientists that were shown on the screen. And 20 years later, they traced back that just seeing a woman in that role made a lot of girls go into STEM. And this, again, galloped throughout the time and just normalized this diversity. And I would say the same is happening in wargaming, because that is what I have experienced, and that was a very open community and very open wargaming groups. So I can only speak in positive terms about it, which of course makes me very happy. But if that is a different experience for other women, then I think it has to be discussed as well and then addressed. So on my side, I can say that women in wargaming are a rare creature, but they are for me equal with males that are playing. And I did not notice something about their participation in war games that was drastically different to men. I did see maybe a couple of anecdotes that can be later also viewed. We had one team that divided. So they said there will be a good cup and the bad cup. And which one would you say the woman played?
Bad cop.
Bad cop.
Why?
Because she's like, I want to be the bad cop. I want to be the tough guy, right?
We're all married.
Fair
We know
enough.
it's bad cop.
She was basically presenting the aggressive style in negotiations, and her male colleague was very calm, and he tried to look for the middle place. That was quite interesting to see how that distributes, and that you know it immediately. That's also fun.
You notice I didn't comment.
20
Kev
years.
Kev's the white team on that one.
Yeah.
uh,
I'm
20
always watching.
Yeah, 20 years from now, we're going to call it the Natalia effect instead of the Scully effect. Getting more women into
Exactly.
wargaming. They'll trace it back to this moment when she was on Whiskey Charlie.
There you go. Well, now, with that said, do you go to, outside of professional war games, do you go to any conventions, any war game conventions?
Those that are within my range, I would say. So I was always in Essen, but obviously this year we are a bit suffering the effects of circumstances, so that is for now not possible. And I was in different exchange clubs as well as wargaming club. That it is not so prominent probably as US, but it is still viable in Netherlands to meet together in a pub and play out a war game. So that is always fun.
So what war games are you playing?
Well, I have to say we didn't see each other for 6 months, so that will come.
Before that?
Yeah, actually, the last time that we played, we had coin series. So we had 2 free tables that were playing different scenarios. And we also, if I can, I bring my own designs as well to test that. Because I get tons of feedback, like I saw this in the war game from 1950, so I cannot beat that amount of repository that they have. And we exchange this way, so we always show each other, okay, this is a good system, this is interesting mechanic, and it goes around.
Now, when you said coin games, were there any specific coin games? Liberty or Death, perhaps?
No, not Liberty or Death. We played Fire in the Lake, I believe.
Okay.
That's a good one.
And that was the case, but we have to see. I hope that we can do it somewhere in July to squeeze in another war game.
Well, that was a question that Harold had asked. That's why I was leading into this. Was how familiar are you with the well-known war game designers like Mark Herman, Volko Runke, Uwe Eichert, things like that. Harold Buchanan, who did Liberty or Death, and Mark and Volko did the Fire in the Lake game. So you already have experience with that one. And what type of games do you like? Operational, strategic, tactical. What do you enjoy the most?
I'm not discriminating any war game. So actually, I like to play around and test everything. So I also give a chance to any level of or scenario, maybe with the exception of I do not prefer the alternative Cold War endings kind of games because I think the ending we had was already quite difficult. So it can only get worse. Why are you playing it?
Well, it's the whole what if the kinetic thing actually happened rather than what if the way it panned out happened. So I think it's that we had all these cool toys and tools. We wanted to see what they would actually do in action versus in theory. So still, a war game is still theory. True.
And indeed, I like from time to time to have a short tactical game for the fun of it. For the bigger games, I think you also experience it, that it is difficult to find somebody to play with.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe with now the digital improvements that will become easier. And if I look at my own gaming experience, that's quite funny because other people noticed it about me earlier than I saw it. That, for example, I like when cards are a component. So I didn't consciously notice it, but then when I looked at the top 10 games that I have played out in the last years, all of them have cards in them. And I also like when you can win different ways. So you are not bound to one winning strategy, and basically you missed a step in the 16th row and then you are done with the game. So that is quite annoying, of course. And indeed, I like to discover during the game that you can build up different things and they are possibly successful. And when the game a bit shows you from the beginning who is in the lead and that that person wins, yeah, that is also not really building suspense. So there is kind of a couple of quirks that I like as a player, I have to admit.
So Harold has a comment. Nate, are you trying to hypnotize Kev with that twirl?
He's driving me nuts. I go, whoa, I think I keep trying to fall.
Next says he's trying to hit you in the head.
I gotta admit, unfortunately, I did not have as much prep time to get ready for this show as I normally do because my little boy broke his arm recently. So we've been in and out of the doctors, getting him a cast and all that stuff. And we got him a couple little toys, and one of them was this little purple slappy thing that is just addictive as hell to twirl it and slap it against things. So my apologies, guys.
I noticed.
I don't know. You just gotta play.
That's your new nickname then. Yeah, I'm going to call you Slappy from now on.
Slappy.
Instead of spanking you.
Sorry, we get a little distracted sometimes.
We're like kids. I mean, you know, squirrel. Hey, but now with all this stuff, everybody being in lockdown and all, you did mention about digital gaming. Have you been able to get more involved in digital gaming just for fun, whether it be with Euros or it be with war games? Have you been able to do that during this whole lockdown?
I am conspiring to make one with my students from The Hague University. So we very much wanted to do that somewhere June, July. And as soon as they are finished with their exams, I believe we can play it out. So I wanted to do a crossover between a Matrix game and kind of worker placement from the hobby side. So you would have more focused experience, and your successful actions would cause you to have more actions, which can create asymmetric mechanics. And that is something I want to work on throughout the summer, and let's see, hopefully release it as well as a PDF somewhere end of the summer. And it is very much open format war game, so it could be played out on the table, but as well through Zoom or other tools that are readily available.
Oh, very cool.
Oh, so you haven't tried things like Vassal or some of the games they have on Steam?
That depends indeed on what is the idea, because most of the war games that I play are quite valuable because you do it with people, and I think you lose a bit when you go online. But indeed, I imagine sometimes that is the only option, or it can be more comfortable because it takes care of the setup and the counters for you, so that is a big advantage. But I didn't do that much because most of my war games were indeed based on interaction.
No, I don't blame you. I prefer to see it, touch it, have it in front of me rather than the digital. So I'm 100% with you on that one.
But a big key, like Natalia was saying, the biggest key with this type of wargaming is the interaction. You know, we have interaction when we do these chats, we have, you know, with the audience and with our guests and ourselves, but it's really key in what she's doing with that type of war game to have, you know, people, you know, they're the biggest commodity in that game. As far as the interactions, they're, you know, cooperating together and planning, and then also maybe throwing them off a little bit. Say, hey, this is what's going on. Hey, there's some new intel, and give them bad intel. So now they've got to act on that and see how they handle that, and how that also, you know, moves the game forward. But the biggest thing is just seeing how everybody, at least what I'm getting out of it, is trying to derive policies and procedures based on how people interact and how they react based on their knowledge, their understanding, and their area of expertise. Kev? Nate, what's so funny?
Harold, look at his comment.
What did he say now? What did he say
asking
now?
if she had tried Twilight Struggle and what her opinion is on the greatest war game ever created.
Have you ever played Twilight Struggle? Do you know what Twilight Struggle is, Natalia?
I see it a lot, but I have not played it.
Oh, she's not played it. So we have to get you a copy of that. You have an iPad?
That's because she's a wargamer and she doesn't necessarily need to play it, or a resource placement.
Well, she loves cards.
Oh yeah,
Well, it does have cards.
And Twilight Struggle.
That's the top card-based war game. It is definitely that.
Twilight Struggle has a couple of cards in it. You'll like it. No, it's very, very card-driven.
Very interested, but indeed it has the topic that I would normally avoid. So I would have to put myself in the right thinking. Yeah.
But it's actually about the Cold War. It's not post-Cold War. So it's not a hypothetical World War III. It's more of a, you're gaming out the Cold War. Could you change history? So in that regard, you may be interested in it.
Yeah, because that one has more to do with the actual, like what she was talking about earlier, the influence blue and red were exerting rather than just strictly military forces, right? Because I hate to say it, I'm going to admit it, I haven't played Twilight Struggle, so I know some people are going to get a little perturbed in the comments. I just haven't got around to it. It's on my shelf, but I just haven't played it yet.
It's a resource placement game, right? So
Which one?
it's a resource placement game.
Which game is a resource placement?
Twilight Struggle.
Oh,
Yeah.
well,
You basically got to get control of them.
area control. So, I mean, it depends. Everyone will, it's the age-old argument. Is it a war game?
I'm teasing.
No, if you like card games, you should definitely check it out because you can get it on a tablet for just a couple of bucks, and there's a computer AI that runs the opponent. Just if you don't have someone to play with, there's that one to play.
Yeah, you could definitely play. And, you know, I got to say, you are definitely, if you ever come to the States, definitely make sure to check out one of the war game conventions that happen. If you can come during the summer, WBC is a big one. That's in July. That lasts like 10 days or something like that in Pennsylvania, which would be closer to you. I know it's a long trek either way, but you want to try to stay East Coast, obviously. So that one would be a good one. And if you do, make sure that you post it up there because there'll be a lot of people that'll come up to you and say hi and invite you to the table because you're welcome at my table anytime to play. And me and Nate will be there. So we'll have fun.
And if you are ever in Netherlands, then this is an invitation here.
Nice. Fantastic.
How far are you from Amsterdam?
1 hour.
Hey, yeah, there we go. I can.
Well, we can't go now.
Well, yeah.
Nobody in the world wants the U.S. anywhere right now.
And take Twilight Struggle with you, then we can test
There you
it.
go.
Are you guys, just out of curiosity, are you guys on restriction? Like, are you allowing foreigners to travel into your country right now?
That is a good question. I think there is a EU-wide, I don't want to call it sanctions. There are some measures that they took to control the flow of people, and it is very much based on the country and, let's say, the level of how well the country is dealing with COVID. So how many new infections you have and whether your response is effective. So I think that it is EU-wide, unfortunately, that US citizens are controlled or limited in their movements. But for Netherlands, I have to say that their results are improving, so the measures are also now decreased.
Well, I hope everything sticks well for you guys.
Same
So-
for you.
Harold says that he predicts Natalia would love Twilight Struggle. So there you
Now
go.
I have to play it.
And David says, don't get Harold worked up because Harold's talking all kinds of stuff over here. I think really must have triggered him because he's saying, do you ever war game against zombies? It's like, who doesn't?
Can you tell a lot of the people that watch this are all war game designers? Harold, David, all of them in there designed war games, so they're very much intrigued right now. And they're all telling you which the best are.
And Dave has a comment there that he says the Netherlands is home to my family's favorite place on planet Earth. Now I'm going to probably screw this up. It's either Efteling or Efteling.
Well, the Dutch
it's neither, right?
I can also show probably how not to say it because I only speak Dutch for 2 years. But they have instead of ge a ge. So maybe they would say Efteling.
Ah, okay. So that wasn't too bad off.
Don't cite me on that.
There we go. Well, close enough for government work, or for wargamer work, I guess. Now, we probably like to make sure that we get our pronunciations correct. Kev, did you have another question?
I'm great. No.
He's great. So Kev is great. We know that. He's the wargame wizard from Oz. Now, we have to come up with a nickname for Natalia.
Definitely. And anytime you have a topic that you think I could bring something interesting in, just let me know.
Well, she already said definitely. Her nickname earlier. Scully.
What is it?
Scully.
No, that's a Scully effect. Now, the Natalia effect will be next. But the one thing I would like to ask is, do you have any plans? You were talking about getting, with your people at the school together to come up with a war game. Now, do you have any plans in the future, maybe, of doing something like that open to the wargaming public, where you would bring in a certain amount of wargamers and just run them through a simple game just to see how wargamers would handle it?
I think that that's a really good proposal that I will add to that plan. So I think it is a very good comparison between wargamers and students. I did that with the previous games because it shows you what is more instinctively understood and what is more advanced knowledge or angle on things. So that sounds like a good addition. And yeah, maybe I will just announce it somewhere on Twitter or...
I'm in.
To do that. If you have 2 hours that you can spare, that could be quite fun.
Yeah, no, I think that'd be a lot of fun.
Sign me up.
We'll definitely, me and Kev are in. Nate, you in?
I'm always willing. I'm always in.
We're gonna bring in Harold just because I know he's gonna want to get in on this, and I don't want him bursting blowing an aneurysm here or something like that on the chat. So we'll bring in Harold too as well. Well, actually, I think he left. So Robert says that Natalia is the Jack Ryan of wargaming. Jack E. Ryan. I guess we should say.
Well, I had a running joke with my colleague because we were just waiting at the airport to get into the plane at one of our travels, and I asked them, do you know what is my second name? Because it was on the ticket. And for some reason he responded, Jack. So that fits Natalia Jack Vojtovic for some reason.
There you go.
Stuck around for the next 2 years. So,
Nate, do you have a last question here for Natalia?
No, I'm good. I just got to say I appreciate you coming on and chatting with us. You did great. It really educational, teaching us some stuff from the professional side we didn't know before. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that.
Absolutely.
Was a great experience for me, so I think it will open a new chapter in the next volume.
There you go. Well, now we definitely... Kev, go ahead.
No.
Oh, I thought you were saying something. I didn't want to cut you off.
I was just excited that there's a new chapter. Maybe you'll be referencing it, Mark.
There you go. Nice. We'll get all of us into her next book. But no, definitely let us know about if you plan on doing something online, because I know we would all definitely love to be involved in that. And I know there's some people in the audience that would as well. So the bigger you make it, the more people will definitely come in. And I'm sure that when the call gets out there for other wargamers, they're going to be like, yeah, I'm in, So I think it'd be something, it would be a great experience. I think it's a great experiment too, for you from an academic perspective, to do something like that and see how it all plays out with just a bunch of wargamers. And I think it'd be a lot of fun. But Natalia, really appreciate you taking the time tonight. It is over 3:15 a.m. in the Netherlands right now. So don't want to keep you up all night. I know that everybody's asked questions. I tried to get as many of them as I could in. Wanted to get our questions in. Wanted to let you get your say, but definitely don't want to keep you up all night. Really appreciate you taking the time, Natalia. Thanks a lot for coming on. And everybody, thank you for your questions. And we will see you guys next time on the next episode of Whiskey Charlie. Have a good night.
Take care.